That was the first thing Clara Whitmore noticed, the way Randall Holt shoved open the door to the Black Ridge Valley schoolhouse like he owned the air inside it. He was a broad man, red-faced from cold or fury or both, and he walked straight past the row of children, still sitting at their desks, without so much as a glance at them. He walked straight to Clara. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" His voice cracked silences like a boot through ice. "Worming your way into that house, into those children, into his bed for all anyone knows." Clara felt the blood leave her face. 12 children sat frozen behind her. "Mr. Holt, don't." He pointed one thick finger at her, close enough that she could see the trembling in it. "My sister is buried on that hill. Her children are in that house. And you, a woman nobody wanted, think you have any right to walk through her door?" Nobody wanted. The words hit harder than a slap because they weren't entirely wrong, and Randall Holt knew it. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and still felt completely invisible, if you've ever wondered whether you were meant to have a place in this world at all, then this story is for you. Stay until the very end, because what happens to Clara Whitmore is the kind of thing that makes you believe people can surprise you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara Whitmore had not always been invisible. There was a version of her life she used to imagine when she was younger, a house with noise in it. Children tracking mud across the floor. Someone calling her name from another room just because they wanted to know she was there. She had held on to that version longer than was probably wise. Long enough to watch every woman she grew up with marry and settle and complain about the very things Clara would have given anything to have. By the time she turned 34, she had stopped imagining. She taught school in Black Ridge Valley because she was good at it, and because children were the closest she was likely to get to a family of her own. She knew every child's particular way of being difficult. She knew which ones needed a firm word, and which ones needed to have a piece of paper slipped quietly onto their desk that said, "I see you working hard today." She knew how to make a room feel safe when the world outside it didn't. What she couldn't do was make herself feel safe in the town that employed her. Black Ridge Valley was the kind of place that rewarded belonging. If your family had been there 2 generations, people remembered your grandmother's recipes and forgave your mistakes. If you arrived alone, with no husband and no family name anyone recognized, you were tolerated at best. Clara had been tolerated for 11 years. She had a boarding room above the harness shop on Clement Street. The landlady, Mrs. Pryor, was not unkind, but she charged by the week and never learned Clara's middle name. Every December, Black Ridge Valley threw itself into the holiday season with the kind of enthusiasm that only small towns manage. Wreaths on every door, lanterns strung between the telegraph poles on Main Street, the smell of pine and baked sugar coming from every direction. Clara loved it and hated it in equal measure. The town became beautiful in a way that made her loneliness sharper by contrast. She was walking home from school on the 3rd Thursday of December, when the temperature dropped so fast she could feel it in her teeth. The sky had gone the color of old pewter. She pulled her coat tighter and took the shorter route past the edge of the stockyards, which smelled even in winter, but saved her nearly 8 minutes of cold. That was where she saw Mason Callahan for the first time up close. She had seen him from a distance the way everyone in Black Ridge Valley had seen Mason Callahan from a distance. He was not a man who went unnoticed, not because he tried for attention, but because he had the particular quality of taking up exactly the space he occupied, no more and no less, which was rarer than it sounded. He was standing beside the fence at the stockyard's edge talking to the auctioneer, and whatever the auctioneer said made Mason go very still in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Clara would have kept walking. She had no reason not to. But then the auctioneer laughed, and something in Mason's face shifted into an expression Clara recognized, without meaning, to the careful blankness of a person who had decided years ago that showing pain in public was a luxury they couldn't afford. She kept walking, but she thought about that expression for the rest of the evening. 3 days later, she was at Dunmore's general store picking up chalk and a tin of lamp oil when she heard Zason and Callahan's name mentioned at the counter. Two women she didn't know well were talking in the half-lowered voices that meant they thought they were being discreet. 5 children, and not a one of them dressed warmly enough for December. I'll tell you that much. The oldest girl, Nora, I think she's been cooking their meals since she was 12. That's not right. Mason does his best. Mason works himself to a shadow and comes home to a house that nobody's keeping. Eleanor's been gone 4 years. He hasn't moved a stick of furniture. Can you imagine? Clara could imagine. That was the problem. Paid for her chalk and her lamp oil, and did not say anything because it was not her place. But she thought about Nora, a girl she taught 2 years ago, serious-faced and too careful with her words, the way children became when they were carrying things they shouldn't have to carry. She thought about 5 children and 1 man and a house that nobody was keeping. She did not expect to think about it again. But Black Ridge Valley was a small town, and small towns had a way of folding things back toward each other. The following Saturday, she was at the church social, not because she was particularly social, but because Mrs. Pryor had mentioned twice that Clara never came to anything, and the third time it would have become an argument. Clara stood near the table with the apple cider and watched people talk to each other with the ease of long familiarity and tried not to look like she was counting the minutes. That was when Mason Callahan walked in with all 5 children arrayed around him like a small mismatched delegation. She recognized Nora first. The girl was 15 now, and she had the same careful eyes as before, moving quickly across the room to assess it the way someone does when they've learned to anticipate problems. Behind her came 2 boys, maybe 10 and 8, both of them with their shirt collars slightly wrong. Then twin girls who looked about 6, holding hands so tightly their knuckles were pale. Mason himself looked like a man who had been talked into something he hadn't quite agreed to. His coat was clean, but the cuffs were frayed. He had made an effort with his hair. It hadn't entirely worked. He ended up at the cider table because that was where there was space. And Clara was there because she'd been standing there for 20 minutes with nothing better to do. And so they were suddenly standing beside each other in the particular accidental nearness that small gatherings produce. He said, "You're the school teacher?" "I am," Clara said. "Clara Whitmore. Mason Callahan." He accepted the cup of cider she'd already poured without seeming to realize she'd done it. "Nora talks about you. Said you were the only teacher who didn't make her feel stupid for knowing things." Clara looked at Nora across the room, who was now efficiently organizing the twin girls' hair ribbons without being asked. "She's not a stupid girl. She never was." "No." Something moved through Mason's voice. "She's too smart for her own good. Always has been. Now he stopped. Picked a different sentence. She does too much. I know it. I don't know how to stop it." Clara didn't offer a solution because she didn't have one, and she had learned that some problems didn't want solutions so much as acknowledgement. She said, "She learned it to survive. She'll keep doing it until she believes she doesn't have to." Mason looked at her sideways. "That's a strange thing to know about a girl you haven't taught in 2 years." "I know children," Clara said simply. They stood in silence for a moment. It was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. Then the youngest of the twin girls materialized at Mason's elbow with a confounding speed, tugging at his sleeve and saying something urgent about a broken cookie. Mason handed Clara his cider without thinking, dealt with the crisis, and came back looking slightly harassed. He looked at her holding his cup. He looked at his own hands. Then he laughed a short, rusty sound, like a hinge that hadn't moved in a while. "I'm sorry," he said. I don't know why I did that." "Habit," Clara said, and handed it back. Something shifted in his expression. Not the careful blankness she'd seen at the stockyard. Something under it. Something that had been kept in a drawer a long time. "My wife used to." He stopped again. This time, the stopped sentence stayed stopped. "You don't have to," Clara said. "No, it's..." He rubbed the back of his neck. She was good at holding things. Things people handed her without thinking. She never made them feel foolish for it. He looked at Clara steadily for a moment, like he was trying to work out something that wasn't quite adding up. That's a specific thing to say to a stranger. You're not entirely a stranger, Clara said. Small town. Small town, he agreed. The social continued around them. People drifted past. At one point, the older boy, the 10-year-old, came to Mason with a question about the horses, and Mason answered it with a patience that didn't look performed, and Clara noticed the way the boy stood, close enough to almost touch, not quite touching, the particular posture of a child who wanted contact and had learned not to ask for it. She noticed too many things. That had always been her problem. At the end of the evening, while the Callahan children were finding their coats, Mason stopped beside Clara again. He looked like a man making a decision he hadn't planned to make. The children are going to want Christmas decorations, he said. The house hasn't had any the last few years. I told them this year would be different. I don't entirely know how to do that. Clara waited. The twins asked if they could have someone come help. A woman. He said the word carefully, like it was a thing that might break. 6, they want. I don't know what they want exactly. Someone who knows about, he gestured vaguely, ribbons. Things. I'm not equipped. Clara understood what he was actually asking, and she understood what it had cost him to ask it. She said, I could come by if it would help. The relief on his face was so immediate and so quickly hidden that she felt a corresponding ache in her chest. It would help, he said. She came the following afternoon. The Callahan ranch house was large and well-built and had the particular feeling of a place that had been deeply loved and then left in a kind of suspended grief. The furniture was good quality and arranged practically. There were no decorations. There were no small personal touches that women tend to leave on a home, no particular way. The curtains hung, no particular arrangement of objects on the mantel. The things that had been there were still there, positioned where they'd last been placed by different hands, and everything around them had been left alone. Clara noticed all of this in the first 60 seconds and said nothing about any of it. Twins were named Ada and Bess, and they attached themselves to Clara with the terrifying immediacy of 6-year-olds who had decided. Within 10 minutes, she was seated at the kitchen table with a length of red ribbon and 2 sets of small, fierce hands directing her. 8-year-old was named Thomas. He maintained a studied indifference for approximately 40 minutes before sidling up to ask, in a very casual voice, whether she knew anything about making paper chains. She did. The 10-year-old James watched from the doorway with his father's quality skulls before eventually picking up a pair of scissors. And beginning to cut strips of paper with more concentrations than the task strictly required. Nora did not join them. She moved through the kitchen doing other things, not unfriendly, but not close. Clara understood that too. Nora had been the woman of the house for years. An intruder, even a cheerful, ribbon-carrying intruder, was a complicated presence. Clara did not try to win her. She just worked alongside the younger children and let Nora come to her own conclusions in her own time. Mason moved in and out of the house the way working ranchers do, purposeful and brief. But Clara caught him pausing in the doorway twice. Once when Ada climbed into Clara's lap without warning, and Clara simply adjusted her hold on the ribbon and kept working. Once when Thomas laughed loudly and without self-consciousness for the first time. That second time, Mason didn't move away as quickly. By late afternoon, the kitchen table was covered in paper chains, the front window had a somewhat lopsided season wreath, and Ada had fallen asleep against Clara's arm with a piece of ribbon still wound through her fingers. Clara did not move. She sat in the quiet, in the warmth of the kitchen, in this house that wasn't hers, with a sleeping child against her arm, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Something more fragile than that. Early tentative suggestion of it. Mason came in from outside to find them like that. He stood very still for a moment. Clara looked up and found his eyes, and something passed between them that neither of them had any name for yet. She does that, he said, low enough not to wake Ada. Decides she trusts someone and just goes. She's 6, Clara said, braver than the rest of us. Mason crossed the room and gently lifted Ada without waking her. Clara felt the absence of the small, warm weight immediately. "Will you?" Mason started, then recalibrated. "The children would want you to stay for supper." Clara looked at the table, at the paper chains, at James, still cutting strips of paper in the corner, with a private concentration that was its own kind of peace. "All right," she said. She stayed. And that was how it started, not with a grand decision, not with a plan, but with a piece of red ribbon and a sleeping 6-year-old, and two people who had both, in different ways, forgotten what it felt like to be chosen. The suppers was simple and slightly burned on the bottom because Nora had been distracted and Masons had forgotten the pot. Nobody mentioned it. Thomas talked too much about a horse he'd seen at the stockyard. Ada woke up confused and immediately wanted more paper chains. Bess ate methodically and watched Clara with eyes that gave nothing away. It was ordinary in all the ways that ordinary can be extraordinary when you've gone without it long enough. Clara walked home in the cold with the lantern she'd borrowed from Mason, thinking that she should not read too much into a supper. She was a practical woman. She knew how easy it was to misinterpret kindness for something more, and she had made that mistake before, years ago, and paid for it in a specific and instructive way. She was not going to make it again. She told herself this firmly, all the way back to her room above the harness shop, where Mrs. Pryor had left a lamp burning in the window. She told herself this right up until the moment she hung up her coat and found in her pocket a small folded piece of paper. She opened it. It was a paper chain link, one of Thomas's, slightly uneven, with his initials scratched into it in pencil. No note, just the link. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. Outside, the lanterns along Clement Street burned in the cold, and somewhere across the valley, a ranch house that had been silent for 4 years had a lopsided wreath in its front window. Clara Whitmore, who had spent 11 years being tolerated by Black Ridge Valley, pressed the paper link flat between her palms and allowed herself, just for a moment, to wonder. Paper chain link stayed on Clara's windowsill for 4 days before she let herself think about what it meant. She told herself it meant nothing. A child had put something in her pocket. Children did things like that, impulsively, without the weight of intention. Adults would read into them. Thomas was 10. He wasn't making her a promise. He was a boy who liked paper chains and had probably forgotten about it entirely by the time she'd walked through the door. She taught her classes. She graded her papers. She ate her supper at the boarding house table with Mrs. Pryor and an elderly man named Garrett, who boarded in the room at the end of the hall and never spoke at meals except to ask for the salt. She did not go back to the Callahan ranch. She had made herself that limit clearly. On the walk home, one afternoon, one supper, a kind gesture returned with a kind gesture, and that was the shape of it. She was not a woman who inserted herself into situations. She was not the kind of person who misread an invitation for decoration assistance as something more significant than it was. On the 5th day, Nora Callahan appeared at the schoolhouse door. Clara saw her through the window, first standing outside in the cold, with her hands in her pockets, not knocking, which was a Callahan habit, apparently. She was looking at the ground with the expression of someone rehearsing something. Clara opened the door before Nora could talk herself out of whatever she'd come to say. "Whitmore." Nora's voice was careful. "I wasn't sure if you'd be. I thought you might still be here. I'm usually here an hour after the children leave," Clara said. "Do you want to come in?" "Huh." Nora came in. She stood in the middle of the empty classroom and looked at the paper chains still hanging from the window frames, the ones the younger students had made as a project, not the ones from the ranch, and something moved through her face that she controlled quickly. "Ada's been asking about you," Nora said, "every day. Ada and Bess both. Thomas pretends he hasn't, but he mentions you." She stopped, reconsidered. "I'm not here because of them, though. I wanted to another stop. I wasn't kind to you when you came. I wasn't unkind either, but I wasn't. I kept my distance on purpose. I noticed," Clara said without making it an accusation. "I've kept my distance from everyone who comes near that house." Nora said it matter-of-factly, like she was describing weather. There have been a few women since Mama died. They meant well mostly. One of them rearranged the kitchen the first week she came, and my father didn't say anything, but I could see it bothered him. And she was back twice more, and then she wasn't. Nora looked at the floor. They always rearranged things. Clara said nothing. She just understood she wasn't supposed to yet. You didn't touch anything, Nora said, except what we asked you to touch. The ribbons and the paper didn't. She pressed her lips together. You didn't try to fix us. You don't need fixing, Clara said. You need breathing room. Nora looked up. She had her father's eyes, that same quality of taking careful stock. Ada didn't fall asleep on anyone in 2 years. Not since Mrs. Hartley from the church stopped coming by. Something shifted in Nora's face, something younger than her 15 years. She used to fall asleep on Mama. The weight of that sentence filled the room quietly. I don't want to be your mother, Clara said. I'm not her. Couldn't be, and I wouldn't try, I know. Nora's voice was small. That's actually why I'm here. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. She held it out to Clara without quite meeting her eyes. Papa wrote that. He wanted to send it, but he wrote it. And then he didn't send it, and I finally took it off his desk this morning. Clara unfolded the note. It said, The children ask about you. I don't have a good reason to invite you back, except that the house felt different when you were in it. I don't know what to do with that M. Callahan. She read it twice. She folded it back along its creases. He doesn't know I brought it, Nora said. He's going to be irritated. Probably, Clara agreed. Are you going to come back? Clara looked at the paper in her hand. The girl standing in the middle of her classroom, with her careful eyes and her too-old posture, and the small held thing in her expression that was maybe hope and maybe a warning against hope, she couldn't quite tell. Yes, Clara said. I'll come back. Nora nodded once like a decision ratified, pulled her coat tighter and walked to the door, and then she stopped without turning around and said, I'm not going to make it easy. I know, Clara said. I need you to know that. I know, Nora. The girl left. Clara stood in the empty classroom, holding a folded note from a man who hadn't been able to send it himself, and felt the future shifting slightly on its axis, the way it does before something changes that you can't change back. She went back the following Saturday. Mason met her at the door this time. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. Then he looked past her toward the road, as if calculating how far Nora could have gotten that morning before he noticed the note was missing from his desk. Brought it, Clara said. I see that. He stepped back from the door. I would have sent it. Eventually. I believe you. He looked at her sideways. You don't, but that's all right. He was not wrong. The second visit was different from the first, in the way that second visits always are. The novelty had worn off, and what was left underneath it was the actual texture of things. Ada and Bess were still enthusiastic, but Thomas had a splinter in his thumb that was making him cross, and he took it out on the paper he was supposed to be cutting, shredding it into uneven pieces while claiming he wasn't upset about anything. James had disappeared into the barn and sent back no delegation. Mason's house, in the daylight, showed more of itself than it had before. The ware on the kitchen table, where children had done their homework for years. The mark on the doorframe where heights had been recorded. She could see the last entry, 4 years old. Now the pencil's line stopped abruptly, like a sentence cut off mid-word. The chair near the fire that nobody sat in. That chair pulled at her attention all afternoon. It was positioned perfectly for reading, angled toward the light, a small table beside it, and it was the cleanest piece of furniture in the room, in the way things are clean when they haven't been touched. She didn't say anything about it. She helped Thomas with his splinter, which required negotiation, ration, and some stubbornness on both their parts. And eventually a needle from Clara's sewing kit and a great deal of wounded dignity from Thomas before it was over. He said thank you with his jaw, set in a way that meant he was still irritated but willing to concede the point. You're welcome, Clara said. Next time, don't wait 3 days. How'd you know it was 3 days? The splinter told me. He looked at her with deep suspicion, then something that was almost a grin before he suppressed it. Mason came in from outside to find Clara at the kitchen counter cutting potatoes. He stopped. "You don't have to do that, I know," she said. "Where's your pepper?" "Second shelf." He said it automatically, then caught himself. "You're a guest." "You have 5 children and a ranch to run," Clara said. "Guest is a waste of everyone's time." He didn't argue. He washed his hands at the basin and stood beside her cutting carrots, and they worked in a silence that was comfortable in the way that silences can be between people who haven't known each other long enough for it to be comfortable. Made it stranger and more significant than either of them acknowledged. After a while, Mason said, "I don't usually let people in the kitchen." I gathered Eleanor. My wife, she had opinions about the kitchen. Very specific opinions. He was looking at the carrots, not at Clara. Kept it her way. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. Or he stopped cutting. Thomas used to come in and rearrange the mugs. Just slightly. I put them back every time. I don't know why I did that either. Clara set down her knife. "What order does he put them in?" Mason looked at her. "The mugs," she said. "What order does he put them in?" "By size," Mason said slowly. "Smallest to largest. That's a perfectly reasonable system." Mason was quiet for a moment. Something worked through his face, something complicated and interior that she didn't try to read. "It is," he said finally. "I suppose it is." He put the carrots in the pot and didn't say anything else. But that evening, when Clara went to pour herself a cup of coffee, she noticed the mugs were arranged smallest to largest. The weeks that followed found a shape of their own. Clara came on Saturdays and stayed through supper. She came on Tuesdays sometimes. If she'd promised to help Thomas with his arithmetic, which had somehow expanded to include James, after James had refused 3 times to admit he was struggling and then been caught copying from his brother's paper. "I wasn't copying," James said. He was 12 and had the particular certainty of 12-year-olds who have not yet been wrong enough times to doubt themselves. "I was checking against your brother's incorrect answer." James looked at Thomas's paper. "Oh, sit down," Clara said. He sat down. They worked through long division for an hour. By the end of it, James had the stiff, slightly dazed expression of someone who has been made to understand something they'd been determined to misunderstand. And Clara had a headache, and they both considered it a reasonable outcome. Nora, true to her word, did not make it easy. She was never rude. She was never even cold, exactly. But she watched. She watched Clara the way you watch a fault line, not expecting anything right now, but not looking away either. She noticed when Clara reached for something in the wrong cabinet, and when Clara mispronounced the name of the family's oldest horse, and when Clara, without thinking, sat in the chair near the fire one Tuesday evening because she was tired and it was close and she simply forgot. She remembered the instant her knees bent. She started to stand back up. "It's all right," Mason's voice from the doorway. He was looking at the chair with an expression she couldn't entirely parse. "It's a chair, I wasn't thinking," Clara said. Clara." Something in his voice had changed register. "Chair." She sat back down. Her hands were not entirely steady. Mason came in from the doorway and settled into the chair across from her by the window. His chair, clearly worn in exactly the shape of him, and picked up the newspaper he'd set down an hour ago and didn't read it. Neither of them spoke. From the kitchen came the sound of Ada and Bess arguing about something small and urgent, and Thomas's voice brokering peace with the weary authority of an 8-year-old who has done this before. And underneath it, all the low, comfortable sound of a house that had people moving through it. After a long while, Mason said, "She would have liked you." Clara didn't ask who. She waited Eleanor. She had no patience for people who didn't say what they meant. You say what you mean. He turned a page of the newspaper he wasn't reading. You don't flutter. She hated fluttering. Fluttering? Women who come into a room, and he made a gesture that somehow conveyed nervous small talk and excessive pleasantry that, "I don't flutter," Clara agreed. "No." He looked up briefly. "You sit in dead women's chairs without apologizing for it." Apologized. "And then sat back down when I told you to." Pause. "She was in that chair the last good evening." Mason said, "Reading." James had a cold. She'd been up 2 nights with him, and finally he was sleeping, and she came downstairs and sat right there, and she just sat, didn't say anything. Just sat. His voice was level. The level of someone who has gone over a particular piece of terrain enough times to know exactly where the drops are. That was 3 weeks before she got sick. I keep thinking I have this idea that if I could get back to that evening somehow, I could. He stopped. I know that's not how it works. No, Clara said gently. It isn't, I know. He folded the newspaper with unnecessary precision. That's the part I hate. The knowing. The fire worked between them. Clara thought about what she could say and discarded most of it. Finally, she said, My mother died when I was 8. I used to hold my breath in rooms where she'd been. Like if I breathed too much, I'd use up what was left of her. She looked at the fire. I was 8, but I don't think the feeling entirely goes away. I think you just learn to breathe around it. Mason didn't say anything for a moment. Then, how long did it take? I'm still learning, Clara said honestly. Something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but recognition, like a lock finding its key. They didn't speak for another 10 minutes, and it was the most connected Clara had felt to another person in longer than she could accurately measure. It was also the moment Nora chose to come into the room for a glass of water, and she stopped in the doorway and saw them, her father and this woman, sitting on either side of the fire, not touching, not even particularly close, just existing in the same quiet with a kind of ease that Nora had not seen her father have with anyone in 4 years. Clara saw her see it. Nora got her water. She went back to her room. She didn't say anything. But the next morning, when Clara came downstairs, she found Nora in the kitchen making biscuits, and Nora looked up and said, without preamble, Do you know how to make a good gravy? Papa always burns it. I do, Clara said. Then maybe you should show me, Nora said, since apparently you're going to keep coming here. It wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't kept distance either. Clara tied on an apron and stood next to Nora at the stove and showed her how to build a gravy from the pan drippings without scorching it, and Nora listened with a focus that Clara recognized from the classroom, the particular attention of a quick mind that has decided something is worth learning. It was, Clara thought, the closest Nora had come to saying welcome. She didn't push it. She cooked her gravy and let Nora stir it and talked about nothing in particular. And by the time Mason came in from the morning chores, the kitchen smelled like something good, and neither woman mentioned what had shifted. Town, however, had begun to notice. Blackridge Valley had a post office where people collected their mail twice weekly, and a general store where information moved faster than the mail, and a particular bench outside the barber shop, where 3 or 4 men gathered on mild afternoons to discuss things that were not strictly their business. Clara knew all of this. She had lived here 11 years, and she understood exactly how news traveled. She heard about herself on a Tuesday at Dunmore's store, standing in the next aisle, while 2 women discussed the school teacher who'd been spending her Saturdays at the Callahan ranch. It's not appropriate, said the first voice, which Clara identified as belonging to a woman named Vera Glasscock, who had strong opinions on most subjects and rarely needed information to form them. She has no standing to be in that house. She's not family. She's not even a particular friend of the family. The children seem to like her, said the second voice, careful and slightly uncomfortable. The children are children, Vera said. They'd like anyone who brought ribbons and paid attention to them. That's not a qualification. That man is a widower with property and 5 children who need a mother. And there is a certain type of woman who is very adept at positioning herself. A pause heavy with implication. Clara Whitmore has been a spinster for 34 years. I'm simply saying people should think about what motivates a woman in her position. Clara stood in the next aisle with a tin of lamp oil in her hand and let the words settle over her. Spinster, position, motivates. She could have walked around the aisle and said something. She knew the shape of what she would have said, and she knew it would have been dignified and clear, and afterward she would have felt terrible for a week because she hated confrontation in the way that people do when they've spent their lives trying not to take up too much space. Instead, she set the lamp oil on the shelf and bought only what she'd needed from the other side of the store and walked home in the cold with her hands shoved into her pockets and her jaw set. She told herself it didn't matter. People talked. People had always talked. She'd been the subject of town conversation before the schoolteacher who'd never married, the woman nobody wanted, as Randall Holt would put it months later with considerably more force. She knew how to carry that. She'd been carrying it for years. What she hadn't been prepared for was that it would get back to Mason. He mentioned it the following Saturday, not directly, the way men mention things they've heard that have upset them, but that they're not sure they have the right to be upset about. He said, "I heard there's been some talk about your coming here." Clara set down the bowl she was holding. "There is. Does it bother you some?" He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to keep coming if it causes trouble for you." Something rose in Clara that was not quite anger but adjacent to it. "Mason, do you want me to stop coming?" "No." "Then don't offer me the door to be polite. That's worse than just saying what you mean." He blinked. Then something in his face resolved. "You're right. I'm sorry. I don't want you to stop coming." "Then I won't." But the talk didn't stop. It adjusted, the way gossip does, the content becoming slightly more pointed as it lost novelty. Vera Glasscock was not the only voice, just the loudest one. There were women in town who felt Clara was overstepping, and women who felt the opposite, and a general low-level civic debate about the schoolteacher's presence at the Callahan ranch that Clara heard about in pieces through Mrs. Pryor, who had the grace to be embarrassed about passing it along, but not quite enough grace to stop herself. And then, on a Saturday in January that had turned viciously cold overnight, the thing happened that Clara would later think of as the moment the story became something she couldn't step back from. She arrived at the ranch in the early afternoon to find the household in a state of controlled alarm. One of the mares, a gray named Persimmon, 7 years old, and Mason's best breeding horse had gone into an unexpected early labor. Foal was coming wrong. Mason was in the barn with his hired hand, a taciturn man named Greer, and the situation was bad. Clara came to the barn door and took it in. Persimmon was down. The foal was partially presented and exhausted, and the mare's breathing had the particular quality of something that had been working too hard for too long. Mason's face when he looked up was the face of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. "Go back to the house," he said. It was not unkind. It was simply a statement about what was useful. "Where?" "I grew up on a ranch," Clara said, "in Wyoming. Until I was 14. Mason and Greer both looked at her. "I've seen this before," she said. "Not often, but I've seen it." She was already rolling up her sleeves. "What do you need?" What followed was 2 hours of the worst kind of work, the kind where you know exactly how bad it could go and you do the next necessary thing anyway. Clara worked beside Greer when Mason needed another pair of hands in the stall, and beside Mason when Greer needed to manage Persimmon's head, and beside both of them in the long stretches when it was simply a matter of waiting and being present for an animal in distress. She didn't flutter. She didn't hesitate. She did what was needed and asked clear questions when she needed information, and didn't speak when speaking would have been in the way. Mason noticed she could see him noticing. The foal came at dusk, a colt, dark and damp and bewildered by his own existence, scrabbling on uncertain legs while his mother huffed at him with the exhausted but present authority of something that has survived. He was alive. Persimmon was alive. The barn smelled of effort and straw and the particular sharp warmth of animals pressed close. Greer said something brief and satisfied, and went to see to the other horses. Clara was on her knees in the straw, not because she'd chosen to be, but because that was where she'd ended up. And she was looking at the foal work out his legs with the intense focus of the newborn, who has no idea yet that any of this is difficult. She was aware without looking that Mason was standing very close behind her. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen from him, all the careful management of it gone, just the thing itself, open and somewhat overwhelming, like a man who had made a decision without quite meaning to. "Thank you," he said. It was the simplest version of what was in his voice. The actual thing his voice was carrying was much larger, and they both knew it, and neither of them reached for it yet. "You're welcome," she said. She stood. Her knees ached and her coat was past saving, and there was straw in her hair, and she did not care about any of it, because in the dimming light of the barn, with a new foal, finding his feet in the straw, something had shifted between her and Mason Callahan that was not going to shift back. They walked back to the house together in the early dark, Kravnos not touching, not speaking much, the cold settling around them with the specific density of January in a valley surrounded by hills. Inside, Nora had fed the younger children and put Ada and Bess to bed and was sitting at the kitchen table with her school primer, and she looked up when they came in and took in Clara's ruined coat and her father's expression and went back to her primer without a word. But when Clara came through to wash up, she found that Nora had left a warm cup of coffee on the counter beside the basin. No note, no acknowledgement when Clara turned to say thank you. Nora was already back at the table, head down, reading. Clara drank the coffee. Her hands were steadier than she expected. What she did not know, standing in the warmth of that kitchen, while the foal settled into the barn, and the children slept upstairs, and Mason moved through the house doing the last tasks of the evening. What she did not know was that Vera Glasscock's youngest sister lived 2 properties over and had seen Clara come out of the Callahan barn at dusk with her coat undone and straw in her hair, and Mason Callahan walking close beside her in the dark. By Monday morning, the story had been told 5 different ways in Black Ridge Valley. None of the 5 versions were accurate. 3 of them were damaging. And the one that reached the school board, Clara, would not know this until later, was the worst of all. She was in the middle of Thursday's reading lesson. 12 children bent over their primers when the door opened without a knock. Vera Glasscock walked in. Behind her was a woman Clara didn't immediately recognize older, with the careful, expensive clothing of someone from outside Black Ridge Valley, and an expression of predetermined conclusion. "Miss Whitmore," Vera said. "This is Mrs. Edith Farrow. She's the regional superintendent's secretary." Clara set down her reading text. She looked at the children and said calmly, "Take out your arithmetic workbooks, please. Work through page 14. Then she walked to the door. Whatever was about to happen, she was not going to let it happen in front of 12 children. What Vera said in the hall was essentially what she'd been saying everywhere, that Clara's conduct at the Callahan ranch had become a matter of community concern, that her continued presence in Mason's household was improper, and that her position as school teacher required a standard of character that Clara was no longer meeting. Mrs. Farrow said very little. She was there to listen, apparently, to gather information for a report that would go to the superintendent. Clara stood with her back against the hallway wall and felt the cold of it through her dress, and listened to Vera Glasscock dismantle 11 years of work with the cheerful efficiency of a person who has never doubted she was doing the right thing. And she kept her face neutral because she had 12 children 10 feet away, and because she knew with the absolute animal clarity of a person who has survived this before that if she reacted the way she wanted to react, Vera would win. "I have a class," Clara said when Vera was done. "If you have a formal complaint, I will respond to a formal complaint in writing, through the appropriate channels." She looked at Mrs. Farrow. "If the superintendent has concerns, I am happy to meet with him directly. Tuesday mornings are best." She went back into the classroom. She sat down at her desk. She said, "How's page 14 coming along?" Thomas Callahan, sitting in the 3rd row, looked up from his workbook and looked at her face and looked at the closed door and looked back at her. "Fine," he said carefully. "Miss Whitmore, are you all right?" She met the eyes of a 10-year-old boy who had given her a paper chain link without knowing what he was doing, and who looked at her now with his father's quality of attention, and she said, "I'm fine, Thomas. Keep working." She was not fine, but she was also not going anywhere. Outside, January pressed against the windows. Inside, 12 pencils scratched at 12 workbooks. Clara sat at her desk and breathed through what had just happened and made herself stay present. In this room, with these children, in the work that had been her life's purpose, long before Mason Callahan's barn and Persimmon's foal, and a cup of coffee left on a counter by a girl who kept her distances deliberately. She was not going anywhere. That at least was simple and true. The formal complaint arrived on a Friday. Clara found it slipped under the schoolhouse door. When she came in that morning, an envelope with the regional superintendent's seal on the outside and the particular weight of official displeasure on the inside. She stood in the cold classroom and read it once, then set it on her desk and built the fire and rang the bell for the children and taught the full day without mentioning it to anyone. That evening she wrote her response at the small desk in her boarding room, by lamplight, with the care she gave to anything that mattered. She was precise and factual, and did not apologize for anything she had not done. She stated that she had assisted a neighboring family during a period of difficulty, that her conduct at all times had been appropriate, and that she welcomed any formal inquiry the superintendent wished to conduct. She sealed the letter and left it at the post office the following morning before school. Then she went to the ranch. She hadn't planned to tell Mason about the complaint. She had decided on the walk over that it was her business to manage and not his problem to carry. But Mason had the frustrating quality of noticing things that weren't being said, and he took one look at her face when she came through the kitchen door and said, "What happened?" It wasn't a question. Clara set down her bag, she told him, kept it brief and factual, the same way she'd written the letter. And she watched his face go through several things in quick succession anger. First, then something colder than anger, then the careful steadying of a man who has learned to think before he acts. "I'll go talk to the superintendent," he said. "You won't," Clara said. "That makes it worse. It turns it into exactly what Vera Glasscock wants it to be." "What does she want it to be?" "A man defending a woman's honor," Clara said, "which implies there's honor to defend. Which implies there was something improper. There wasn't. The letter I wrote says so clearly, and I need it to stand on its own." Mason looked at her with the expression he got when he disagreed but was reconsidering. "You shouldn't have to fight this alone." "I'm not fighting it. I'm responding to it." "There's a difference." Clara sat down at the kitchen table because her feet were cold and she was tired. "The worst thing I can do is act like it frightened me, because then it will." He sat across from her. He was quiet for a moment in the way he went quiet when he was actually thinking, rather than just pausing. "She's been doing this for years," he said. "Vera, Eleanor dealt with her. She had a way of," he stopped. "She could make someone feel they'd made a mistake without ever raising her voice." "I don't have that skill," Clara said. "No," something in his voice that might have been almost fond. "You're more direct. It's caused me problems before. And solved some, I'd imagine." They sat in the quiet kitchen, and through the ceiling came the sound of feet, the particular rhythm of Ada and Bess playing something that involved running they'd been told not to do indoors, and were doing anyway, with the commitment of children who have calculated the distance between themselves and adult authority. Mason looked at the ceiling. "They're going to knock something over." "Probably," Clara said. Neither of them moved. Something had settled between them in the last weeks, not declared, not named, but present the way weather is present, in everything, and touched by everything. Clarissa was aware of it the way she was aware of her own heartbeat, mostly in the background, occasionally too loud to ignore. She was also aware, with the clear-eyed practicality that had carried her through 34 years of a life that had not gone the way she'd imagined it, that awareness was not the same as wisdom, and that the space between what she felt and what made sense could be very wide indeed. She did not examine it. She filed the complaint response and kept coming to the ranch and kept teaching her classes and kept her head down and waited for the storm to either break or pass. Did neither. It became Randall Holt. She had not known Eleanor had a brother until a Tuesday afternoon in late January when she came to the ranch and found a horse she didn't recognize tied at the post, and Mason's voice coming from inside the house, with an edge she'd never heard in it. She almost turned around. She made it 3 steps back toward the road before she heard something break inside, not glass. Something smaller. A cup maybe, and then Nora's voice. high and young and very frightened. Uncle Randall, stop. Clara walked back. She opened the door. The kitchen had the frozen quality of a room where something bad is happening. Nora stood near the far wall, with Ada and Bess pressed behind her, the twins with their faces half hidden in Nora's skirt. Thomas and James were on the stairs. James 2 steps lower, his body angled forward in the unconscious posture of a boy, deciding if he needed to do something. A broken mug was on the floor near the hearth. Randall Holt stood in the center of the room. He was larger than Clara had registered in the schoolhouse, broad through the shoulders, with Eleanor's coloring, but none of her grace, red-faced and vibrating, with something that had been building for a while before it arrived here. Mason stood across from him near the fireplace, very still, which was the stillness of a man holding himself in deliberately. Everyone looked at Clara. Randall Holt's eyes moved over her with the particular contempt of a man who has already made his verdict. "This her," he said. Mason said her name low in warning. Randall. Clara kept her voice even. She addressed him directly. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I'm the school teacher. I know who you are," Randall said. "Whole Valley knows who you are now. The woman who's been working her way into my sister's house. I've been helping with the children," Clara said. "You've been helping yourself," he said, "to a dead woman's family, to a grieving man who doesn't have sense enough to see what's in front of him." He turned to Mason. "Your wife is 4 years in the ground, and you've got some school teacher in her kitchen, in her chair, teaching her children to forget her. Nobody is forgetting her." Mason's voice was flat. "Watch yourself. I'll say what needs saying." Randall took a step toward Clara, and she held her ground because she'd made a decision about that the moment she walked through the door. "You have no place here. Eleanor's children don't need you. Mason doesn't need you. This is a family, and you are not part of it." The room was very quiet. Ada had her face completely hidden now. Bess was peeking, her eyes tracking between Clara and this man who smelled like cold and anger, and maybe something else, something that had been fermenting longer than today's argument. Clara looked at Randall Holt steadily. "You're right that I'm not family," she said. "I've never claimed to be. I don't intend to replace anyone, least of all a woman I never met." She kept her voice level because the children were in the room and because she meant it. "But I will also tell you that the children you say don't need me. One of them has been mothering her siblings since she was 11 years old. One of them hadn't laughed in months before December, and the 2 behind Nora didn't sleep through the night without waking up afraid until 3 weeks ago. Yoset sensei the way. I know that because I've been here, and I've been here because Mason asked me to be, not because I inserted myself." Randall's face had gone a deeper red. "You don't know the first thing about this family. I know the parts I've been shown," Clara said, "which is more than some people with the legal right to know them." That landed. She saw it land the specific sting of the truth that he'd stayed away, that Eleanor's brother had not been here in the months and years since Eleanor died, that his outrage was arriving long after the crisis that produced it. Randall knew she saw it. His jaw worked. Then he turned to Mason with the pivot of a man redirecting. "She's going to ruin them," he said, and his voice had shifted from fury to something rawer. "What happens when she leaves? What happens when she gets what she wants, when she moves on to something better and those children have attached themselves to her and she just goes? You know what that does to them? You know how many times Ada woke up screaming for her mother the first year?" Mason's face had changed. Clara saw it change. She watched the fury drain out of it and leave something much worse underneath guilt, the specific and corrosive kind that doesn't require logic to function. Randall had aimed well. He had not been guessing. He knew exactly where Mason was most exposed. "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said. "You say that now," Randall said, and now he was talking to Mason, not her. "They all say that. The neighbor woman who came in the spring after Eleanor died said that, and she was gone by summer, left Ada with a rag doll and 2 months of habits to unlearn." He took a breath that was unsteady at the edges. Eleanor trusted people. She trusted everyone. It was the best thing about her, and it got her hurt more times than I could count, and she's not here to protect her own children now. So somebody has to say, "That's enough." Mason's voice had gone very quiet. Mason, I said enough. He looked at his brother-in-law, and the look was complicated grief and anger, and something that might have been understanding, the kind that comes from recognizing someone else's wound, even when it's being used as a weapon. Eleanor trusted people because she was a good reader of them. She got it wrong sometimes. So do I, so does everyone. He paused. You don't know, Clara. I know. Enough. You know what you decided in the first 5 minutes. Mason picked up the broken mug from the floor automatically, the way you clean up after something without planning to. Stay for supper if you want. We can talk after the children are in bed. But say one more thing like that in front of them, and I'll ask you to leave. Randall Holt looked at the floor. Something in him was still fighting, and something in him was exhausted. The way grief exhausts people into versions of themselves they don't entirely recognize. He had driven a long way to say things that needed saying, and some of them had landed, and he was not ready to let go of the rest. He left. He didn't stay for supper. He took his horse, and he went back down the road the way he'd come, and the sound of the hooves faded out, and left behind a kitchen with 5 children in various states of distress and 2 adults who had just been through something, and were now supposed to make it right. Nora came away from the wall. She was shaking slightly, controlled, the tremor of someone who held themselves rigid through a thing and is now standing on the other side of it. He didn't used to be like that, she said, not defending him, just placing it. He was when Mama was alive. He used to bring us licorice from town. He used to teach James how to do card tricks. She looked at the door. I think he just misses her and doesn't know what to do with it. Yes, Clara said. I think that's right. That doesn't make it okay. No, Clara agreed. It doesn't. She made supper. She made it simply and without fuss. And Mason moved through the kitchen without speaking much. And the children ate with the subdued quality of children who have witnessed adult conflict and are still processing its shape. Thomas asked once whether Uncle Randall was coming back, and Mason said he didn't know. And Thomas accepted this with the solemn practicality of a 10-year-old who has learned that some questions get honest answers, and this was one of them. After supper, Clara helped Nora with the twins and sat with Ada until the small girl's grip on her hand loosened into sleep. She was aware, standing in the doorway of Ada's room, looking back at the child, that Randall Holt had not been entirely wrong in his fear. Attachment was real. Children attached. If Clara left when, or if the shape of all this changed, it would cost Ada something. It would cost Bess something. It would cost Thomas his careful not asking, and James his arithmetic, and Nora her morning-made gravy. She stood in the doorway and held that fact honestly, without flinching away from it. Then she went downstairs. Mason was at the kitchen table, with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, and his hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular. Clara sat across from him. She didn't say anything, because the thing that needed to be said required him to get to it at his own speed. He said after a long time, "He's not wrong. About the risk." "No," Clara said, "he's not." Mason looked at her. "That doesn't upset you?" "I understand the risk," she said. "I've thought about it. Every time Ada falls asleep on my arm, I think about it." She kept her eyes steady on his. "And I keep coming back." Why, it was a real question. The simplest and most complicated one. Clara thought about how to answer it honestly without giving him something he wasn't ready for. She said, "Because I'm not performing something. I actually care about your children." And she stopped, continued. "And I care about what's happening here. I don't know yet what it is exactly. But I'm not here for strategy. I don't have a strategy. I'm a woman who was spending December alone in a rented room and who got invited to help with ribbons and stayed because it turned out to matter to me." She looked at the table. "That's all." Mason was quiet. Then he said something she didn't expect. "I think about Eleanor every day. I don't think that's going to stop. I don't want it to stop. I want to keep her somewhere. Real." He touched the glass without picking it up. "And I think somewhere I decided that meant keeping everything exactly as it was. Which isn't." He stopped. Started again. "She wouldn't want that. I know she wouldn't want that. She was the least static person I ever knew. She would hate it." Clara waited. I looked at you tonight, Mason said. When he was saying those things, and you just stood there, like the floor was yours. He looked up. That chair you sat in, you sat back down when I told you to. Most people would have kept apologizing for a week. Something moved through his face. I keep thinking Eleanor would have liked that about you. The second time he'd said it. The first time it had felt like an offering. This time it felt like something else, like a door, with a handle he'd put his hand on. Clara said carefully, I'm not Eleanor. I know. His voice was rough. Not I know that. He pushed the whiskey glass aside. I'm not asking you to be. They sat in the silence, and Clara could feel the shape of what they were both not quite saying, the outline of it, like a figure in fog. Too soon. Both of them knew it. Neither of them looked away. What happened 3 days later broke everything open anyway. The temperature dropped overnight, the way it sometimes did in February in the valley, catastrophically. 30 degrees in 6 hours, the kind of cold that killed livestock and split wood and crept under every door. Clara woke at 4 in the morning to ice on the inside of her window and the sound of wind that had a voice in it. She was not at the ranch. She was in her room above the harness shop on Clement Street. She pulled her blankets tighter and told herself Mason had managed winters for years before she came and would manage this one without her. She was almost back to sleep when she heard the horse. The rider reached the boarding house door 20 minutes later. It was Greer Mason's hired hand, who had ridden 2 miles in that cold, which told Clara everything before he said a word. The boy, Greer said. Thomas, he's sick. Mason sent me. Dr. Hirsch can't get through. Roads drifted over. Mason said he wouldn't ask, but Thomas has been calling for you. She was dressed in 4 minutes. The ride to the ranch was the longest 2 miles of her life. Cold was the kind that took the inside of your nose and made breathing an exercise in tolerance. Greer rode ahead, and Clara followed, and she did not think about what she was going to find, because thinking about it would not help. What she found was Thomas. He was in his bed with the particular stillness of high fever, not sleeping. Somewhere else, somewhere fever makes its own geography. His face was the wrong color, and his breathing was shallow. And when Clara put her hand to his forehead, she felt the heat of it, and kept her face very neutral, and said, in her most ordinary voice, I'm here, Thomas. He opened his eyes. They were glassy and distant, but they moved to her face and stayed there. Miss Whitmore, he said. His voice was barely there. Right here, she said. I've got you. Mason stood in the doorway. She had never seen his face like this, stripped of every layer, just the bare, terrible love of a father looking at a sick child, and underneath that something she recognized as the particular fear of a man who has already lost someone and has learned in his body what loss costs. How long? Clara said. Since midnight. He was fine at supper. Then Nora heard him okay. Clara was already taking off her coat. I need cloths. Cold water. How much willow bark do you have? Some. Not much. Get what you have. And get Nora, I need someone to keep him talking. What followed was a night that Clara would carry for the rest of her life, not because it was the worst thing she'd been through, but because of what it required. It required all of her, everything she knew, everything she'd observed, all the years she'd spent in schoolrooms, watching children, and learning the difference between a child who is simply unwell and a child who is going somewhere you can't follow. She stripped the fever down degree by degree with cold cloths and willow bark tea, and the careful, stubborn refusal to let Thomas sleep too deeply for too long, because deep sleep with a fever like this was a risk she understood. Nora sat on the other side of Thomas's bed and talked to him. She talked about nothing about the foal, about a book she'd been reading, about a memory of their mother making snow candy in February when Nora was 7. Her voice was steady. It didn't waver. Clara looked at her across the bed at 2 in the morning and felt a specific kind of respect that had nothing to do with fondness. Mason sat in the hallway with his back against the wall. He didn't come in unless Clara asked. He stayed because leaving was not something he could do, and he knew being in the room would cost him something he couldn't afford to spend right now. Clara came out to him at 3. She was wrung out and cold despite the house's warmth, and her hands were dry from the water. She sat down on the floor next to him because there was no chair, and she was too tired to go find one. His temperature is coming down, she said, slowly. He's staying with us. Mason closed his eyes, just for a moment, then opened them. Clara, he said. He's going to be okay, she said. He needs watching the rest of the night, but the worst is passing. Mason turned and looked at her, and she could see in the lamplight from Thomas's doorway what 4 years of managing alone had cost him, and what tonight had cost him on top of that, and she did not look away from any of it. You should have been a doctor, he said. I should have been a lot of things, she said. I'm what I am. He reached over and put his hand over hers. He didn't grip it or make it into something larger than it was. He just put it there, his rough rancher's hand over her cold one, and left it. She didn't move. They sat in the hallway while the night wore down, and Thomas's fever did the same, and somewhere the twins were sleeping unaware, and James was sleeping, and only Nora was awake, still talking in her steady voice about snow candy and the foal and things she remembered, keeping her brother in the room with her through the sheer familiar comfort of her voice. 5 in the morning, the fever broke cleanly. Thomas's eyes focused for the first time in hours, and he looked at Nora and then craned his head to see the hallway and said hoarsely, Is Miss Whitmore still here? She's here, Nora said. Okay, Thomas said. He closed his eyes properly. Good. Clara heard it from the hallway. She felt Mason's hand tighten briefly on hers. The dawn came gray and still, the storm blown out, and the world outside crusted white. Clara stood at Thomas's window, watching the light come, and listening to the boy, breathed the steady, unremarkable breath of a child who is simply sleeping, and felt the particular exhaustion that comes after something that required everything, and came out right. She heard Mason, behind her. There's something I should tell you, he said. Turned. He was in the doorway, his hair wrong and his shirt wrinkled from the night, and he looked like a man who had made a decision somewhere in the last 8 hours and was not going to unmake it. Randall came back, he said, yesterday morning before the storm. He left something, a letter. I wasn't going to read it until he stopped. It's from Eleanor. One of the letters she left. She wrote them before she died, to be opened later. Different ones for different. She was very organized. His voice was rough at the edges. The one Randall brought. I think she meant it for when I needed to hear it. Clara waited. I haven't opened it yet, Mason said. Okay, Clara said. I want to, he said. I think I'm ready to. He looked at her steadily. I think it's because of you that I'm ready. The morning light was growing in the window. Thomas breathed on in his uncomplicated sleep. Down the hall, Nora had finally stopped talking and gone quiet, and the silence of the house was the different silence of a place that has been through something and come out the other side of it. Clara said, then open it. Mason looked at her for a moment longer. Then he went down the hall to his room, and Clara stood at Thomas's window, watching the white valley, and hearing nothing but the boy's breathing and the distant sound of the foal shifting in the barn. And she waited for whatever was going to happen next, with her hands steady at her sides, and her heart doing what hearts do when they understand, before the mind quite catches up, that something is ending and something else is beginning, and the border between the two is exactly here. He was in his room for a long time. Clara stayed at Thomas's window and watched the valley go from gray to white gold as the sun came up over the eastern ridge, and she listened to the boy breathe, and she did not go to Mason's door. Some things required witness, and some things required privacy, and she had enough experience of grief to know the difference. Thomas woke briefly at 7, asked for water, drank half of it, and went back to sleep with the boneless ease of a child whose body has decided the emergency is over. Clara tucked the blanket around him and smoothed his hair back from his forehead. The fever was down to something manageable, something that sleep would continue to work on, and she let herself breathe all the way out, for the first time since Greer had knocked on the boarding house door in the dark. Nora appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. She held one out to Clara without a word. Clara took it. They stood together at the window, not quite side by side, both of them looking at Thomas's sleeping face with the particular vigilance of people who have been afraid and are now allowing themselves to be slightly less so. You should sleep, Clara said. You were up all night. So were you. I'm used to managing on less. Nora looked at her sideways. That's not something to be proud of. Clara almost smiled. No, I suppose it isn't. They drank their coffee. Below, the ranch was beginning its morning. She could hear Greer in the yard, the horses responding to feed, the ordinary machinery of the place resuming after the night's interruption. Ada and Bess were still quiet, which meant they were either asleep or engaged in something private and self-contained, which with 6-year-olds could mean anything. He's going to read it, Nora said. Not a question. Yes. Nora turned her cup in her hands. She left 7 letters, one for each of us, and one she called it the general one. For when things got complicated, she paused. Papa's had them in his desk for 4 years. He opened mine last Christmas. I don't know what the others said. What did yours say? Clara asked, and then immediately, you don't have to tell me. It said to stop mothering everyone. Nora's voice was dry and young and hurt all at once. She said she could see me doing it even then, when she was sick, and she said it was the most loving thing and also the most dangerous thing, and that I needed to let myself be young while I still was. She stopped. I read it and I put it in my drawer, and I kept mothering everyone, because what else was I supposed to do? Clara said nothing. She understood that some truths from people we've lost arrive too early to be acted on. We need time to earn them. She would have liked you, Nora said. It was the 3rd time Clara had heard that in this house, and this version was the hardest one, because it came from the daughter who had watched her mother most closely and missed her most precisely. She liked people who knew what they were about. She had no patience for vague people. I've been told I'm not vague. No, Nora said. You're not. She looked at Thomas. When he asked for you last night in the fever, I almost came to get you myself, before Papa sent Greer. I know, Clara said. I could see it in your face when I arrived. Nora absorbed this. Then she took both empty cups and went back down to the kitchen, and Clara sat in the chair beside Thomas's bed and let herself rest without sleeping and listen to the house come back to itself around her. Mason came out of his room at 8:30. She heard his door and then his step in the hall, and she went to the doorway of Thomas's room, and they looked at each other across the short distance of the hallway. His face was different. Not devastated, she had prepared herself for devastated, but altered in the way a landscape is altered after rain. Something had moved through it and settled. He held the letter in his hand. He had folded it carefully. Come downstairs, he said, when you're ready. She gave Thomas another 10 minutes, checked his forehead still warm but not frightening, and went down. Mason had made coffee badly, which she had learned was his way when something was occupying most of his mind. It was very strong and slightly oversteeped, and she drank it without comment because it was not the moment to discuss coffee. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. Their table now, she thought, and then caught herself thinking it and set it aside carefully. She wrote it 2 weeks before she died, he said. Eleanor. She knew by then. We both knew, but we didn't. We were still pretending we had more time. She must have written it when I was outside. He smoothed the folded letter with his thumb without opening it again. She said she'd been watching me their whole marriage, and she knew when she was gone that I would stop, that I would hold everything still and stop everything moving, because that was what I did when I was afraid. He stopped, swallowed. She said I did it when we lost the first baby, before Nora. She said I just went still and gray and stayed that way for almost a year, until she pulled me out of it by picking a fight with me over the fence line because she knew I'd argue back, and arguing meant I was still present. Clara held her coffee cup and kept her face quiet. She said she wouldn't be there to pick the fight. This time, Mason continued. So she was writing it down instead. He looked up. She said, when I found someone she didn't say. If, she said when. She said I would find reasons to pull back right when it mattered most, and she was telling me now, from wherever she was going, that I was not allowed to. His voice had a roughness in it that he didn't try to sand off. She said the children needed to see me choose someone. Not because they needed a mother, they had one, and they knew it, but because they needed to see that the people they loved were willing to keep going. She said that was what she wanted to teach them most, and she ran out of time. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire worked. Outside, somewhere, Ada had woken up and was talking to Bess in the high confiding tones of 6-year-olds, exchanging urgent morning information. She mentioned you, Mason said. Clara went still, not by name. She couldn't. She didn't know you. He looked at the letter. She said, you'll know her by the fact that she doesn't move the furniture. She said, see, anyone who's been through something real doesn't move the furniture when they enter someone else's house. They understand what things cost. He paused. She said, when I found that person, I should stop being careful and just tell her the truth. The morning light came through the kitchen window at the angle it had. At this hour, particular and familiar now, winter light doing its February work on the table between them. Clara set down her coffee cup. The truth, she said. That I love you, he said it, the ways. He said most important things directly, without preamble, as if the only way through was straight through. That I've been working up to knowing it for 2 months, and I've known it clearly for about 6 hours, which I realize is not the... I know the timing is not ideal. Thomas is sick. You've been up all night. This is not... He stopped. Eleanor would tell me I'm doing it again, making reasons. Clara looked at this man across the table from her. She looked at his rough hands and his badly made coffee and his wrinkled shirt from the night of fear they'd both just been through. And she thought about a paper chain link in her pocket and a cup of coffee left on a counter by a girl who kept her distances and a sleeping child's grip loosening into trust on her arm. I love you too, she said. I've been less organized about knowing it, but yes. Something moved through Mason's face, relief, she thought, and something younger than relief, something she hadn't seen on him before. He was not a man who showed his underbelly easily. She understood the cost of this. I don't know how to do this, he said. I should say that plainly. I've been married before, and I still don't know how to do this. Neither do I, she said. I've never been married at all. That's supposed to be comforting? It's supposed to be honest. He almost laughed. The rusty hinge sound, but warmer than before. All right, he said. Honest. Honest, she agreed. They sat with it for a moment, this new thing between them, slightly terrifying, entirely real. Not a beginning that felt like a beginning in stories, clean and forward-looking. More like a beginning that felt like what it actually was, two damaged, imperfect people who had both been through enough to stop pretending that anything was guaranteed, choosing each other anyway, with their eyes open. Thomas called from upstairs. Clara went up. She came back down with a report, fever lower, appetite stirring. Thomas's first words upon waking being a complaint that he'd missed breakfast and could he have eggs. She delivered this with the particular calm of someone reporting good military news. And Mason put his face in his hands for a moment in the way that people do when they've been scared for a long time. And the fear has just been given permission to leave. Eggs, he said, into his hands. 2 of them, apparently. Host. He got up and started cracking eggs, and Clara stood beside him, and they made breakfast for a recovering boy and 2 6-year-olds who had appeared at the kitchen door with questions about the snow, and James, who had come downstairs to report with great authority that the road was clear enough for Dr. Hirsch to come through now, which was his way of asking whether Thomas was all right without asking whether Thomas was all right. Your brother's fine, Clara told him, hungry and complaining, both good signs. James's whole body relaxed about 3 inches. He nodded with enormous dignity and went to set the table. The morning continued. Dr. Hirsch arrived at 10 and confirmed on what Clara already knew, and looked at her over Thomas's head with the appraising expression of someone recalculating, and said, whoever managed this fever through the knew what they were doing. Clara accepted the comment without expanding on it. Thomas informed the doctor that Miss Whitmore had been there all night, and that she knew everything, which Clara also accepted without expanding on. Nora came downstairs at noon looking like someone who had slept the sleep of the profoundly exhausted and was not apologizing for it. And she ate a substantial lunch and looked at her father, and then at Clara, and then at her father again and said, with the precision of a girl who has been watching adult behavior, since she was 11. Something happened. Several things happened, Mason said. Thomas was sick. That's not what I mean, and you know it. Mason looked at Clara. Clara looked at her coffee. Papa, Nora said, I'm 15. I have been running this household for 3 years. You can tell me? Mason set down his fork. Clara and I, we've decided that we're... He looked for a moment like a man who is very good with cattle and not as naturally equipped for this conversation, that we'd like to see where this goes. Clara and I. Nora was quiet for a moment. Several expressions moved through her face in quick succession, a rapid private accounting that Clara couldn't fully follow. You said that very badly, Nora said finally. I know. You should have led with something more. Nora gestured vaguely. I know. I was going for honest. You can be honest and also not sound like you're reporting on livestock. Clara pressed her lips together very firmly. Noted, Mason said. Nora looked at Clara. The look was long and careful, and Nora was 15, but her eyes were older than that. The eyes of someone who had sat on one side of a sickbed all night, talking her brother back into the room, and who had, in the process, made some decisions of her own. I meant what I said, Nora told her. I'm not going to make it easy. Some days I'm going to be. She stopped. I loved my mother. I'm always going to love my mother. That's not going to change. It shouldn't change, Clara said. And I'm not going to pretend that everything is just going to work out perfectly because you and Papa have decided something. I wouldn't trust it if it did, Clara said. Nora studied her. You're going to stay, yes. Even when I'm difficult. Especially then, Clara said. Difficult usually means something matters. Something shifted in Nora's face. Not a complete opening, she was too careful and too self-possessed for that, and Clara had learned to love that about her. But a perceptible movement toward it, the smallest possible thaw. All right, Nora said. She picked up her fork. Then I suppose that's that. It was not, of course, that simple. Town of Black Ridge Valley received the news the way small towns receive news that they had already half decided about through a complicated process of already knowing and then adjusting the already knowing to accommodate the official version. Vera Glasscock was not pleased, and she expressed her displeasure through channels that Clara was learning to navigate, the pointed absence of a greeting, the certain kind of commentary that reached you through 3 intermediate people, the sense of a campaign being organized. The school board, when Clara's formal inquiry was resolved, ruled in her favor narrowly, 2 votes to 1, which was narrow enough to feel like a warning even while it was technically a victory. The superintendent's letter said that her conduct had been reviewed and found within acceptable limits, and Clara read those words within acceptable limits and understood exactly how much latitude she did not have. She told Mason about it on a Saturday in late February, standing in the kitchen after lunch. He said, I'm going to talk to Weston. Weston Draper was the school board chairman, a reasonable man with a daughter in Clara's class, whom he was privately very pleased with. You can talk to Weston, Clara said, but understand that how this looks matters. If it looks like you're pressuring the board on my behalf, I'm not pressuring anyone, Mason said. I'm a father of school-age children who has a legitimate concern about the stability of their teacher's employment. Community conversation I'm allowed to have. Clara looked at him. That's actually quite shrewd. I have my moments. He talked to Weston Draper. He also talked, Clara learned later, to 3 other families whose children were in her class. Families who had not previously had strong opinions about Clara Whitmore one way or another, but who, when asked directly whether they were satisfied with their children's education, said yes, emphatically. The conversations were quiet and without drama, and by March the particular pressure on Clara's position had eased in the way that institutional pressure eases when it runs out of fuel. Vera Glasscock did not ease. She was a more durable opponent than a school board inquiry, because her currency was social rather than official, and social pressure didn't resolve through proper channels. Clara continued to receive the pointed absences of greeting. She continued to hear, in filtered form, the commentary that moved through town, continued also to hold her ground. Not with the exhausting effort of someone fighting. Fighting would have burned her out, but with the quieter persistence of someone who has decided on a direction and is simply continuing to move in it. Children helped. Not intentionally, not strategically, but in the way that children help, by being visible and specific. Thomas recovered from his fever and went back to school and mentioned Clara so frequently in conversation with other children that her presence in the Callahan household became ordinary information rather than scandalous information, which was a meaningful distinction in a small town. Ada and Bess appeared at community events attached to Clara's hands with the calm assurance of children who have decided and are not going to be argued out of it. James, who was 12 and male, and therefore navigated social reality differently, simply told the three boys who tried to tease him about it that Miss Whitmore had helped his father deliver a foal and fix Thomas's fever, and they could think what they wanted about that. And the boys, who respected competence the way 12-year-olds do, largely decided to think nothing. Nora's contribution was the most complicated and the most significant. She did not speak publicly about Clara in the way the younger children did. She was not demonstrative by nature, and she was old enough to understand that her endorsement, offered too deliberately, might look calculated. What she did instead was simply continue to be seen with Clara, treating her presence as unremarkable shopping at Dunmore's store together, walking to the post office, sitting beside her at the spring community supper, in the way you sit beside someone whose proximity you take for granted. Small towns notice what they take for granted. It was a more powerful argument than anything anyone could have made out loud. Randall Holt came back in March. He came alone this time, without the previous visit's fury, which was itself a kind of information. Tied his horse at the post and actually knocked. And when Clara opened the door, he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not warm, not apologetic, exactly, but the particular look of a man who has been sitting with something and has arrived at a different position than where he started. "Is Mason here?" he said. "He's in the barn. I'll get him. I'll wait." He stayed on the porch. He did not come in, and she understood that this was not unfriendliness but a kind of deliberateness. He was waiting for Mason, not inserting himself into the household this time. She got Mason. She left them on the porch and went back to the kitchen and occupied herself with legitimate tasks and did not listen, which was harder than it sounds because she very much wanted to listen. They were out there for 40 minutes. When Mason came back inside, he had the weathered look of a conversation that had gone to some difficult places and come back. Clara was cutting bread and she looked up and he said, "He's going to stay for supper." "All right," she said. Randall Holt came in from the porch and hung up his coat with the careful manner of a guest who is not sure of his standing. He said, "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Holt," she said. He sat at the table, and Thomas came downstairs and saw him, and went still in the careful way of children who remember things. And Randall looked at Thomas and said, "I heard you were sick." "You look all right, I'm better," Thomas said. Miss Whitmore helped. Randall glanced at Clara. "So I understand," he said, with a flatness that was not exactly gratitude, but was not gratitude either. The supper was not comfortable. It was the specific discomfort of people who have said sharp things to each other and are now passing the bread and finding their way through an evening together, because the alternative is breach that nobody actually wants, because underneath the sharpness, there are things that matter too much to abandon. Randall asked Nora about school. He asked James about the horses. He was stiff and deliberate in a way that cost him something, and Clara could see the cost. And she did not make it harder. After supper, when the children had gone upstairs, Randall said, "I owe you an apology." Clara waited. "What I said at the school." In front of he stopped. That was wrong. The words I used. He looked at the table. I didn't believe what I was saying. Not all of it. I was angry and scared, and I said what would land hardest. He looked up. "That's not an excuse." "I know it isn't, no," Clara said. "It isn't." She let that sit for a moment, because she was not a woman who smoothed things over at the expense of honesty. But I think I understand some of what drove it. And understanding it, Doesn't mean I wasn't hurt by it, but it means I don't need to keep carrying it either. Randall nodded. Something in him that had been braced released slightly. She would have wanted this, he said. To Mason, not Clara. Eleanor, she would have wanted. He stopped. She wanted you to stop looking like someone waiting for the next bad thing. She said it in one of the letters. He glanced at Clara briefly. I have one too. She wrote to me. She told me to stop being a wall. He made a short, rough sound. She had very specific instructions for everybody. Mason said. She always did. Something passed between the two men grief shared, imperfectly, which is the only way grief is shared. Clara saw it and let it be private. The evening ended with a handshake between Mason and Randall that carried more in it than handshakes usually do. And Randall rode back out into the March night, and Clara washed the supper dishes while Mason sat at the table and didn't pretend to do anything else. He's not a bad man, Clara said, not turning from the basin. No, Mason said. He's a man who loved his sister and didn't know how to keep being a brother to her family when she was gone. He was quiet. A small and understandable failure. Most failures are small and understandable, Clara said, when you're not in the middle of them. Even then, sometimes. She heard him push back his chair. She heard him cross the kitchen. He stopped behind her close but not touching, and she finished the cup she was washing and set it carefully in the rack. Clara, he said. Yes, she said. He didn't say anything else for a moment. She could feel him making a decision, or finishing one. I'd like to ask you something, he said. I've been trying to find the right time for about 3 weeks, and I've decided there isn't a right time, and I'm just going to ask it. She turned around and faced him. He was very close, and he looked like himself, not arranged into anything, not performing anything, just Mason Callahan in his kitchen, at the end of a difficult evening, asking for something he'd decided to ask for. Marry me, he said. It came out without formality, without a constructed speech, without getting down on a knee, which suited him and suited her. Not because the children need you, though they do. Not because it would settle the talk, though it would. Because I want to be in the same house as you. Because I'm better at this, he gestured, meaning the house, the kitchen, the whole complicated project of living when you're in it. He stopped, not very romantic. It's honest, she said. Is that enough? She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the kitchen around them, the mugs arranged smallest to largest, the chair by the fire where nobody had sat, until she sat in it, the mark on the door frame where heights had been recorded and stopped. Place that had been a house and was becoming a home again by increments, by paper chains and grazed hands and one bad night and one long letter from a woman who had known her husband well enough to write his future for him. Yes, Clara said. It's enough. He reached out and took her hand, not the urgent grip of the hallway the night Thomas was sick, but deliberately this time. Chosen. She held it back with the same intention. There'll be more trouble, he said. Vera Glasscock isn't done, I know. And Nora isn't going to suddenly become easy. I know that too, and I'm not. He paused. I'm not good at all of this. I go quiet when I should talk, and I make everything practical when it needs to be personal. Eleanor used to say I could make poetry sound like a fence-building schedule. Clara felt something rise in her that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to it. I've noticed. And you're still Mason, she said. Yes, still yes. You don't have to qualify it into the ground. He was quiet for a moment. Then the rusty hinge sound, warmer again. All right, he said. She kept his hand. It was large and rough and imperfect and warm, and she held it while the kitchen fire worked itself down, and the house breathed around them with the children upstairs, and the foal in the barn, and the valley white and quiet outside. And she let herself be in it, this place, this life, this ordinary and completely unexpected thing that had happened to her in December when she'd said yes to an invitation for ribbons and stayed because it mattered. She had not planned for this. She had not seen it coming. She had spent 11 years telling herself that the life she'd imagined when she was younger was simply not the life she was going to have, and she had made her peace with that, genuinely, or as close to genuinely as a person can manage. And then Thomas had put a paper chain link in her pocket and Ada had fallen asleep on her arm, and Nora had said, "Teach me the gravy." And here she was, in a kitchen that wasn't hers yet and would be soon, holding the hand of a man who made poetry sound like a fence-building schedule, with 5 children asleep above her head and a valley full of people who were still making up their minds about her. It was not perfect, it was not what she'd imagined. It was better, because it was real, and it was hers, and she had earned every difficult inch of it. They set the date for the second Saturday in May. Not because May was particularly... Mason made that clear when Clara asked, with the mild defensive practicality of a man who wanted credit for choosing well, but didn't want to oversell it. He said May, because the worst of the winter work would be done. The spring calving would be mostly behind them, and the road between town and the ranch would be reliable enough that nobody would have an excuse not to come if they wanted to come. Clara accepted this reasoning because it was the kind of reasoning she had come to recognize as Mason's version of practical on the surface, deliberate underneath. She kept her room above the harness shop until the wedding. This was not romantic convention so much as honest self-preservation. She was a woman who had built her independence out of 11 years of careful management, and she was not going to dissolve it in the 3 months before a wedding, just because the ending was already decided. Mrs. Pryor, who had not previously demonstrated strong feelings about Clara one way or another, surprised her in early April by saying, with the abruptness of someone who has been working up to a thing, "I want you to know, I think you've handled yourself with more dignity than most people would have, and I should have said so months ago." Clara said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pryor." "That woman Glasscock has no sense of proportion, Mrs." Pryor added with considerable energy. "No," Clara agreed carefully. "I've told 3 people that this week. I appreciate it." Mrs. Pryor nodded, as if the matter were settled, and went back to her business. Clara stood in the hallway of the boarding house and felt something shift in the town's attitude, the way you feel a change in the air before you can name what's different, not a dramatic reversal. Small towns didn't reverse dramatically, they adjusted, incrementally, the way ice thaws, 1 degree at a time, invisible until suddenly it wasn't. Vera Glasscock did not adjust. But Vera Glasscock was, Clara was learning, less representative of the town than she was loud within it, which was not the same thing at all. The school board renewed Clara's contract in April without the previous year's near crisis. Weston Draper delivered the news himself, stopping by the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon with the particular manner of a man discharging a civic duty he was also quietly pleased about. He said the vote had been unanimous this time. He said the word unanimous, with a small, deliberate emphasis that carried its own editorial comment about the previous vote. Clara thanked him, and after he left, she sat at her desk for a while in the empty classroom and looked at the paper chains, still hanging from the December project, faded now but intact, and felt the specific satisfaction of having held a line under pressure and not moved from it. She brought Thomas's paper chain link to school the next day and hung it with the others. Nobody asked about it. She didn't explain it. It was simply there, that slightly uneven loop with the initials scratched in pencil, hanging with the rest. The wedding planning was done largely by committee, which was to say by Nora, with input from Ada and Bess that was enthusiastic but not always useful, and occasional comments from Mason that were practical and infrequent. Clara had expected to feel like the center of the planning. She found instead that she was more of a consulting party. Nora had opinions about flowers and the sequence of the afternoon, and which tablecloth from the cedar chest was appropriate, and she presented these opinions as practical questions with clear answers, which was her way of caring about things without appearing to care too much. Clara let her lead. It was, she had come to understand, one of the things Nora needed most, to be allowed to do something for the family rather than simply receiving. The one conversation that was hard came on a Tuesday evening in late April, 3 weeks before the wedding. Clara arrived at the ranch to find Nora at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her, not writing, just looking at it. The younger children were outside. Mason was on the south pasture with Greer, dealing with a fence section that had come down in the last rain. Clara made tea without being asked and set a cup in front of Nora and sat down. Nora said, without looking up, "Are you going to move things?" Clara looked at her. "Furniture. Things in the house." Nora still looked at the paper. "People do. When they move in, they change things." "Some things will change," Clara said carefully. "A household adjusts when it grows." "That's not an answer." "No," Clara said. "It isn't." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "I don't plan to move things for the sake of moving them. If something needs to change because it makes practical sense, I'll talk to you about it. To your father and to you." She paused. "The chair stays where it is. The photographs stay where they are. Nothing disappears from this house that came into it with your mother." Nora looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way she was working to control. She had a way she kept the kitchen shelves. The order of things. "Show me," Clara said. "I already know it." "Then keep it that way," Clara said. "You're the one who knows it. You should be the one who keeps it." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked back at the paper on the table and picked up her pen and began writing something. And Clara drank her tea and didn't push, and after a while, Nora said without looking up, she would have made a scene about the flowers. She had very strong opinions about flowers at events. She would have argued with me about the tablecloth. What would she have chosen instead? Nora almost smiled. "Blue one." She always said the cream one looked like it was trying too hard. "What do you think?" Nora considered. "I think she was right, actually. But I already ironed the cream one." "Then we use the cream one," Clara said. "And we know she would have had something to say about it, and that's its own kind of tribute." Nora set down her pen. She looked at Clara with the old careful assessment, but the thing underneath it was different, now less watchful, more open, like a window that has been stuck and is gradually being persuaded. "I'm not going to call you anything," Nora said. I'm not going to call you Mama. I want you to know that, I know," Clara said. "I'm not asking you to." Nora stopped, started again. "I might call you Clara, just Clara, in front of people." "That's my name," Clara said simply. "Some people will think it's disrespectful." "Some people think a lot of things," Clara said. "Most of them are not standing in this kitchen." Nora looked at her a moment longer. Then she picked up her pen again and said, "I think the ceremony should start at 2. Light is better at 2. Mama always said morning ceremonies made everyone look tired." 2 it is," Clara said. She stayed that evening until the children went to bed. Ada, who had been operating for weeks under the conviction that the wedding was primarily a personal gift to herself, talked at length about what she planned to wear and whether the foal would be old enough by May to come outside and look at things. Bess listened to this with her usual contained attentiveness and then said, very quietly, to Clara, when Ada had moved on to interrogating Thomas about something, "Are you going to sleep here after?" "Yes," Clara said. "After the wedding, I'll be here every night." Bess processed this. Every night. Every night. Bess nodded once, with the grave finality of a child who has received important information and is filing it away. She did not bring it up again. Clara understood that she didn't need to. James, who was 12, and therefore officially unaffected by sentiment, found Clara in the hallway before she left that evening and said, studied casualness, "Thomas says you know how to fish." "I do," Clara said. "We have a good creek on the east pasture," James said. He looked at the wall beside her head. "Maybe sometime you could." He stopped. "If you wanted." "I'd like that," Clara said. James nodded and went back upstairs with great dignity, and Clara went home to her boarding room and packed another box of her things, because she was moving incrementally, one box at a time, settling herself into the ranch house by degrees rather than arriving all at once. The week before the wedding, Randall Holt came back. He came on the Wednesday, with his wife this time, a small, fair-haired woman named Dorothy, who had been mentioned briefly in Randall's first visit and never again, and who turned out, upon introduction, to be the kind of person who assessed situations quickly and honestly and then committed to them without reservation. She shook Clara's hand and said, I told Randall 6 months ago he owed you an apology, and he said he knew it. I'm sorry it took this long. He gave it, Clara said. Dorothy looked at her steadily. You're very generous with him. He loves Eleanor's children, Clara said. Generosity isn't hard when you understand where something comes from. Dorothy blinked. Then she looked at Randall with an expression that said fairly clearly that she was revising a Masematha situation. Randall had the good grace to look slightly humbled. They stayed for dinner. Dorothy and Nora discovered a shared and passionate interest in the same obscure branch of practical botany specifically, which wild plants along the Valley Creek were useful, and which were merely decorative, and spent 45 minutes in a conversation that excluded everyone else entirely, which Nora clearly found more satisfying than she'd expected. Randall watched his niece talk with the ease of someone who has found a subject she cares about, and something in his face went soft in a way that had nothing to do with performance. He said to Mason, low enough that the women couldn't hear, she looks like Eleanor when she gets going about something. I know, Mason said. She's going to be something remarkable. She already is, Mason said. Randall looked at Clara across the table. Clara was listening to something Thomas was explaining about the foal's current temperament with more investment than the subject strictly required. She was nodding with genuine attention. Thomas, who had a 10-year-old's reliable instinct for detecting performed versus real interest, was talking at full speed. Randall said, I was wrong about her. Mason said, I know. I'm saying it out loud. I heard you. They ate their dinner, and the evening was not seamless. Randall and Mason still had the slightly careful quality of two men navigating restored ground, but it was real, and realness was worth more than seamless. A thing Clara had come to believe deeply, and that this particular family was demonstrating at every turn. The second Saturday in May arrived the way days you've been watching for a long time arrive, suddenly, after what felt like a very long approach, and then all at once. Clara woke in her boarding room for the last time. She lay still for a few minutes looking at the ceiling she'd looked at for 11 years, and feeling the particular texture of an ending that is also a beginning, not sad exactly, not simple, just complete, in the way that things are complete when they've been what they needed to be and are now finished, dressed without rushing. She had made her own dress deep green wool, not bridal white, because she was 34 years old and had never been the kind of woman white was made for, and because Eleanor's color had been ivory, and Clara had no interest in even accidental imitation. The green was good on her. She knew it was good on her. She put on her good boots and fixed her hair in the mirror above the basin, and she looked at the woman looking back at her and thought, this is what you look like when you've stopped waiting for your life to begin. It was not a triumphant thought. It was quieter than that, more like acknowledgement. Mrs. Pryor was in the hallway with a small paper-wrapped bundled dried flowers from her garden, tied with a piece of blue ribbon, pressed it into Clara's hands and said nothing, which was the right thing. The ceremony was at 2, as Nora had specified. It was held at the ranch, outdoors in the south field, where the light was as good as Nora had promised, with the valley spread out below and the hills still showing their late spring green. Weston Draper served as the civil officiant, which was a practical choice that also contained its own small statement. The guests were not many. This was not a social event designed to make a point. It was a wedding designed to be real. A few families from town whose children Clara had taught, who came because they wanted to be there. Dr. Hirsch, who had seen the relevant evidence of Clara's character in Thomas's sick room and required no further argument. Greer, Mason's hired hand, who stood at the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man attending something he considers important. Dorothy and Randall Holt, standing close together, Randall with the particular stillness of a man working through something private. Vera Glasscock was not there. Clara had not expected her. She did not think about her. Ada had appointed herself chief of something unspecified but important, and she executed her duties with tremendous seriousness, which meant walking in front of Clara to the field and looking back frequently to check that the process was proceeding correctly. Bess walked beside her sister with her hand in Ada's and her eyes very wide. Thomas stood with James at Mason's side, with the dignity of the occasion visibly pressing on both of them. James managing it through stillness, Thomas through an extreme concentration on not fidgeting that made him fidget slightly anyway. And Nora. Nora stood just behind Mason, not in the position of a bridesmaid in any formal sense, but close enough that it was clear she had chosen to be there, that position, beside her father, for this particular thing. She wore her good dress, the dark blue one, and her hair was done in the way Clara had watched her practice twice in the bathroom mirror in the past week, though Nora would not have admitted to practicing Z. She looked like Eleanor, probably, the way Randall had said. She looked like herself. She looked like someone standing at the border between the childhood she'd been carrying too long and something that might allow her to put it down. When Clara walked into the field, no procession, no music, just Clara walking through the grass in her green dress with Mrs. Pryor's wildflowers in her hand. Mason looked at her with the expression he'd had in the barn the night the foal was born, all the management stripped off, just the thing itself. She walked to him. She stood beside him. Weston Draper said the words that needed saying, and they said the words back. And it was not long, and it was not elaborate, and it was precisely what it needed to be. When Mason took her hand, his was not steady. She noticed, because she was paying attention, and because she wanted to remember it, the slight unsteadiness of a steady man doing something that cost him something real. She held his hand more firmly, and he held hers back, and that was, she thought, the truest description of the whole enterprise. Two people holding on with more firmness than they felt, until the feeling caught up. Afterward, there was food, and the particular ease of people who have been carrying a period of difficulty, and have come out the other side of it with their hands free. Thomas ate an amount that alarmed everyone. Ada appointed herself guardian of the dessert table and consumed enough of her charge to feel unwell later, which she denied. James found Randall Holt's wife Dorothy and resumed the botany conversation with Nora, who was quietly astonished that someone else knew as much as she did about creek plants. Randall stood beside Mason with a glass of cider, and they talked about the ranch in the comfortable shorthand of men who share a frame of reference, and it was not healed, not completely, not with the clean wholeness that stories sometimes promise, but it was working toward something, and working toward something honestly was more than most things managed. Clara moved through her wedding afternoon the way she moved through most things, paying attention, not performing, allowing it to be what it was rather than what she'd imagined it might be. It was better than she'd imagined in some ways, and more ordinary in others. And the ordinariness was the part she valued most, because ordinariness was where she'd been starving. At some point in the late afternoon, she found herself standing slightly apart from the gathering, at the edge of the south field, where the grass was long enough to move in the light wind, looking back at the ranch house. The windows caught the late sun. She could see, in the kitchen window, the hanging shape of paper chains. The children had strung new ones in the days before the wedding. Thomas's idea, executed with group enthusiasm and mixed results. They hung slightly crooked against the glass. She thought about a boarding room above a harness shop. She thought about 11 years of watching other people's houses be warm. She thought about the specific ache of December evenings, walking home from school past lit windows, catching fragments of lives that had interiority and warmth, and someone calling someone else's name from another room. She had spent a long time deciding that ache was simply part of who she was, manageable, a thing to be endured and not dwelt upon. She had been practical about it, as she was practical about most things, and practicality had served her. She had built a life that was good on its own terms, useful, purposeful, respected even when not fully embraced. But there was a difference, she now understood, between a life that was good on its own terms and a life that had been allowed to become what it was trying to become. She had been standing outside her own life for years, watching it through frosted glass, practical and dignified and very, very alone. What she had not understood, what she'd had to learn through ribbons and paper chains and a broken mug and a long fever night, and a letter from a dead woman who had somehow seen this coming was that. Belonging was not a quality you were born into or assigned. It was not the reward for being the right person in the right place at the right time. It was something you built, deliberately, in the middle of difficulty, with people who were also building and also afraid and also, always, imperfect. She had built this. Not alone she knew that clearly. She had not arrived and been welcomed and slotted into a waiting space. She had arrived into a family that was fractured and afraid, and in many ways still living in a different year, and she had worked quietly, stubbornly, without a map or a guarantee towards something that kept being hard and kept mattering, and that was the whole of the story. That was the work. The thought didn't arrive with trumpets. It arrived the way most true things do, quietly, between one breath and the next, while she was standing in a field looking at crooked paper chains, turned back toward the gathering. Mason was watching her from across the field. He had been watching her for a little while. She could tell the way he was standing, the particular quality of his attention, which she had learned to read the way you learn to read weather on a familiar stretch of land. He tilted his chin slightly. A question. She shook her head slightly. She was fine. She was just thinking, and started back toward him, through the long grass, in the late May light. The summer arrived and brought its work with it, which was the ranch's version of mercy. There was always enough to do. That the doing itself became its own kind of harmony. Clara moved from the boarding room to the ranch with her boxes, which didn't fill the space she'd expected them to because she'd spent 11 years accumulating less than she'd realized, and that was its own small reckoning. She taught herself the house by living in it rather than managing it, which was a distinction that mattered. She learned which floorboard sang at night and which door required lifting on the handle before it would latch. She learned that the kitchen's west window let in a draft that was not cold enough to bother with in summer, but would need a rag stuffed in the frame come October. She learned these things the way you learn a person incrementally, through the accumulation of days. Kept Eleanor's kitchen in Eleanor's order. This was not a sacrifice. It was simply right, and it cost her nothing, because she had never been sentimental about the arrangement of shelves. Nora knew where everything was. The children knew where everything was. A household runs on people knowing where things are, and Clara had no interest in being the reason it didn't. What she added slowly. A particular way she made breakfast that the children began to look forward to. A habit of leaving small notes for whoever had done something that needed acknowledging, not effusive notes, just specific ones, because children needed to know their efforts landed, and so did adults. Presence in the evenings that was distinctly hers. The way she read, the particular hush she brought to the house after supper that was different from absence. These were small things. They added up. Nora turned 16 in July, and Clara organized a small celebration that was actually Nora's preferred kind of celebration contained, with the specific food she liked, and enough time and space for Nora to feel marked without feeling exhibited. Nora received it with the slightly guarded gratitude that was her particular register, and said afterward, to Mason, not to Clara, she didn't make it about her. Mason told Clara this later. She nodded and didn't pursue it, because the comment hadn't been meant for her, and receiving it secondhand was enough. Thomas's 12th birthday came in August, and he wanted to fish, so they fished all of them, including Mason, including James, including Ada, who hooked nothing but operated with tremendous conviction, including Bess, who was patient in the way of someone who has decided she is going to succeed and is simply waiting for the fish to cooperate. Clara and James stood side by side at the East Pasture Creek that he had mentioned to her back in April with studied casualness, and they didn't talk much because fishing didn't require it, and that was, Clara thought, one of the better things about James. He was comfortable with quiet, in a way that suggested he'd spent time learning it. Caught the first fish. He said nothing, just looked at it with satisfaction, and then looked at Clara. Good hook, she said. He nodded. I've been practicing. It shows. They fished for another hour, and the afternoon had the quality of something being built without anyone acknowledging the building, which was the best way for certain things to be built. The school year started in September. Clara walked to school each morning from the ranch instead of from a boarding room above a harness shop, and the walk was longer, and the cold came earlier along the valley road, and she did not mind either of these things, because the longer walk meant she had time to think, and the cold was the cold of a morning she was walking toward, and not one she was walking through alone. Classroom was the same. The children were mostly the same, with the New Year's small adjustments, and the arrivals from summer that older students brought in with them. Thomas came to her class, which she had anticipated and prepared, for it was a different relationship, student and teacher, than what they were outside school. And she made that clear from the first day by treating him with exactly the same combination of expectation and humor she used with everyone else. Thomas, who was 10, and no longer wearing his careful not asking so tightly, understood immediately, and sat down in his seat and worked through page 1 of his arithmetic with the expression of someone who is slightly disappointed. There wasn't more drama. She ran her classroom as she always had. This had not changed, would not change. This was hers, the part of her life that had always been hers, and it was not improved by the wedding so much as held alongside it. Both things true simultaneously. What improved was the walk home. In early October, a letter arrived from the regional superintendent's office. It was not threatening this time. It was a formal commendation. Thomas's recovery from the fever had been discussed in certain circles as an example of community response to a medical crisis in a remote area, and Clara's role in it had been mentioned, and the superintendent was pleased to note that Miss Whitmore, now Mrs. Callahan, had demonstrated the qualities most valued in frontier educators. Clara read the letter twice and set it on the kitchen table, and when Mason came in, she handed it to him without comment. He read it. He set it down. He said within acceptable limits. Previous standard, Clara said. I'd say you exceeded it. The superintendent says I met it, Clara said. I'll take met. He looked at her with something in his face that was warm and slightly exasperated and fundamentally admiring. You could have just accepted the compliment. It's not a compliment, she said. Commendation. There's a difference. Is there? One is personal, one is institutional, and the institutional one matters more to you. Clara thought about it honestly. The institutional one protects my students, she said. Personal compliments are nicer. She looked at the letter. But this one is better for the classroom. He shook his head slightly fondly. You are a very specific kind of person. I know, she said. You knew that in March when you asked me. I did, he agreed. I was counting on it. November came and brought its shorter days and its particular quiet, and the preparations for a holiday season that Clara could feel the children anticipating in the way she'd felt December last year. That first December, the ribbons and the paper chains, the beginning of the thing. But it was different now, because she was inside it, not watching from outside. When Ada began planning the holiday decorations with the intensity of a small general, she came to Clara directly, and Clara sat at the kitchen table and let Ada explain her vision at considerable length and made notes. And it was the same table and the same kitchen, but everything in it was different now because she was allowed to belong to it. The holiday arrived, and it was not what stories promise. Bess got a cold. Greer got into a disagreement with Mason about a fence repair that went on 3 days longer than necessary. Randall and Dorothy came, and the visit was warm and also slightly complicated, because it always would be slightly complicated, and that was all right. Thomas ate too much of something and was unhappy about it. James received a book he'd wanted and disappeared into it so completely that he missed half of a meal and was unrepentant, and the paper chains went up again, new ones, made over 2 evenings at the kitchen table, with Ada conducting and Bess executing, and Thomas cutting crooked, and Clara and Nora working alongside each other in the particular easy silence that had taken months to earn, and was now simply the texture of evenings in this house. Clara looked up once and found Nora watching her with an expression that was unguarded for a moment, not the careful assessment, not the watchfulness, just something open and young and slightly surprised at itself. Nora looked away quickly. Clara looked back at her paper chains. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and Mason had gone out to check on the horses and the foal, who was now a gangly yearling with very strong opinions about cold weather, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table with the lamp and the remaining paper chain links, and she thought about the beginning of all this, which was sitting at this same table in December with Ada asleep on her arm and two women working out the early, careful terms of something that would become this. She thought about the woman she'd been in that boarding room, practical, self-contained, honest, about what she had accepted as her life's limits. She did not wish that woman had been different. That woman had been doing what was available to her with what she had, and that was not a small thing. But this was also not a small thing. This was a life that had more room in it than she'd known how to want. The front door opened and Mason came back in, stamping cold off his boots, and he looked at her at the table with the lamp and said, "You should come to bed. It's late." "I know," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" She looked at the paper chain links in her hands. She thought about Thomas pressing one into her pocket without knowing what he was doing, and about the note on Mason's desk that Nora stole and delivered, and about Ada's grip going slack into trust, and about Nora's cup of coffee left on a counter in the barn night dark, and about a letter from a woman who hadn't known her but had known her husband well enough to describe her accurately to him. She thought about Vera Glasscock, who had not attended the wedding and had continued to be Vera Glasscock, and about the school board and the narrow vote that became unanimous, and about the superintendent's letter that said within's acceptable limits and was still sitting on the kitchen shelf because she hadn't decided yet what to do with it. She thought about belonging, what it actually was, underneath the word, not a quality bestowed, not a door you found open or were handed a key to, a thing you built, board by board, in the specific difficult weather of your actual life, with the actual people in front of you, who were never as simple as you needed them to be, and were always more than you expected. "About how I got here," she said. Mason sat down across from her. He reached across the table and picked up a paper chain link and turned it in his fingers, looking at it, with the concentration of a man who has decided something small deserves his full attention. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked. Not anxiously. He was not an anxious man. He just wanted to know. Clara looked at him. She looked at the kitchen around her, the mugs smallest to largest, the shelves in Eleanor's order, the window where the paper chains hung slightly crooked against the glass, the chair by the fire where a dead woman used to read, and where Clara now sat on winter evenings with a book, and the sense of not replacing anything but adding herself to the story the house was telling. "No," she said, "not any of it." He handed her the paper chain link across the table. She took it. "Good," he said. He stood and held out his hand. "Come to bed." She took his hand and brought the lamp, and they went upstairs through the house that breathed around them, the small sounds of children sleeping, the creak of the particular board on the third step, distant sound of the yearlings settling in the barn, the wind coming down off the eastern ridge with the smell of coming snow. She had spent 11 years standing outside other people's light, looking in. She had spent so long watching lives that had warmth and noise and someone calling someone else's name from another room that she had eventually stopped believing the warmth was for her. Here is what she understood now, that she wished she'd known earlier, and knows she couldn't have known earlier because some things can only be learned by surviving their absence. Belonging was never going to arrive. Nobody was going to hand it to her. It was not going to appear because she was patient enough, or good enough, or quiet enough, or practical enough. It was a thing that had to be built, awkwardly and imperfectly, in the middle of fear and gossip, and broken mugs and fever, knights and daughters who kept their distances, and sons who put paper chains in pockets, and men who made poetry sound like fence-building schedules and letters, from dead women who knew more than they should have. It was hard work. It was the best work she'd ever done. The snow came in the night, as it always came quietly, while everyone was sleeping, transforming the valley into something clean and possible and difficult and familiar. In the morning, 8D would see it from her window and call for Bess and run downstairs, demanding to know if they could go outside. And Thomas would already be at the kitchen door, pulling on his boots, and James would come down with his book still in his hand, looking like someone who had not decided yet whether the snow was worth interrupting his chapter, and Nora would appear last, her hair slightly wrong, with the expression of someone who has calculated that the best response to 5 people wanting 5 different things before breakfast is to make coffee first. And Clara would be in the kitchen. She would be making breakfast, the particular breakfast the children had come to expect from her, slightly different from how it had been before, and now simply how it was. She would hear Ada on the stairs, and she would say, without turning from the stove, "Boots first, Ada." And Ada would say, I know, in the voice of someone who did not think boots should be the first thing. And the kitchen would be warm, and the window would show the white valley, and Mason would come in from the morning chores with cold on his coat, and she would hand him a cup of coffee that was not badly made. It was not a perfect life. There is no such thing. There were days that were difficult, mornings that were short-tempered, evenings where the weight of other people's needs was more than anyone had the resources to carry gracefully. There were things that would never fully resolve the particular sadness. Nora carried on certain days that had nothing to do with Clara and everything to do with a mother. She missed with a specificity that years did not blur. The occasional tightness between Mason and Randall that came from too much history and too much love in too complicated a combination. Things were real. Clara did not smooth them over in her mind or in her life, because smoothing them over would have been a form of dishonesty, and she had paid for other people's dishonesty long enough to want no part of her own. What she had instead was this: a house that was hers, family that was hers, not because she had been born into it or assigned to it, or been lucky enough to arrive when the door was open, but because she had stayed when it was hard, and worked when there was no guarantee, and refused to leave when leaving would have been easier. A woman nobody wanted. Randall Holt had said those words in a schoolhouse doorway in December, and they had hit her in the place where she was most exposed because they were not entirely wrong, and she had known it. She had spent 34 years not being chosen. She had spent 34 years making herself useful, and making herself good, and making herself practical and small enough not to impose, and she had not been chosen, and she had learned to carry that without letting it make her bitter, which was its own quiet achievement. But here was the thing Randall Holt had not known, and she had not yet known, and that the year had taught her with the patience, and sometimes the brutality of a good teacher. Being chosen was not the beginning. Being chosen was the middle. Before being chosen, you had to choose. You had to choose to go back when every reasonable voice said it was not your place. You had to choose to sit back down in the chair when someone told you it was all right. You had to choose to stay through the hard conversations and the pointed absences and the fever nights and the voices in the next aisle at the general store. You had to choose, again and again, a life that was not yet yours, until one day it was. That was what the year had cost her. That was what the year had given her. Outside, the snow continued. The valley was white all the way to the eastern ridge. The ranch house windows glowed with the particular warmth of a place that has people in it, visible from the road, from the distance, to anyone who happened to be walking by in the cold. Clara Whitmore, Clara Callahan, stood in the kitchen of her own house and listened to the sound of her family sleeping and let herself be exactly where she was, without qualification, without the old habit of standing slightly outside her own life, in case it turned out not to be hers after all. She had built it, and she was home.